is full of uncertainties. We against the contraction of 4.2% last year, we in the beginning believed that we were going to grow at 4.2% this year, the same amount, except last year was negative, was a contraction. This year was positive. But the fact of the matter is, with or without the second or third wave that we're having now, few countries are likely to recover to their pre-crisis level by the end of the year. So looks like maybe 2022. But of course, with this second or third wave, it looks even harder. Now, the crisis has also had a tremendous impact on youth. You have felt this impact in education, in finding jobs, in social distancing, in the closure of cafes and bars, in traveling restrictions. I was being told by some of you that you're only doing remote education right now, especially after your latest clampdown in the fight against the virus. So although the latest OECD data on youth unemployment shows that it achieved a maximum of, I don't know, close to 19% last April. Well, we were above 14% in any case for the OECD as a whole only a few weeks ago. So COVID-19 is really leaving a scarring effect on our youth. The crisis is also exacerbating pre-existing economic and group-based inequalities, both between countries, but also within countries. The question of inequalities has just grown with the crisis, like it had grown in 2008, 2009. Then it was getting somewhat better with the recovery, and now, of course, it's been growing again. So you must all be facing important challenges, but you're still relatively fortunate. While in income countries, in high income countries, 65% of the students were taught online. In low income countries, only 18% were able to maintain their online studies. Basically, they had no choice. So 2/3 against less than 1/5. Now, as we assess the long-lasting impact of the pandemic, we also worry about the consequences on mental health. According to our survey on COVID and youth, the top concern for the 15 to 24-year-olds was a crisis impact on their mental health. And of course, this will have a direct bearing on our economy. Now, even before the crisis, mental disorders were going to cost the global economy about 16 trillion by 2030. So roughly, 2/3 of the US economy, just to put it in context. So this suggests that the recovery cannot just be economic, but also systemic, in one where we are placed on a sustainable, resilient, inclusive path that takes care of quality of life issues like mental health. Now, in many countries, governments are actually taking concrete actions to invest in young people. and that is the bright side of this story. You know, for example, the reinforced European youth guarantees. That's at the European level, or the UK's reinforced hardship funding for local and international students. That can be a lifeline, as young people are particularly vulnerable, and in terms of resources and you know, cash, they're always very short. This will provide a good framework to ensure that no jobless young person goes without support through this crisis, as we know that youth are overrepresented in temporary jobs. Now, across the OECD, youth are approximately 3 times as likely as older workers to hold a temporary job. And of course, temporary jobs are more precarious, more vulnerable. All EU member states have, for example, that they've committed to ensure that young people under the age of 30 receive a timely offer of employment, of training, or continued education. All this is very positive, very exciting. It's very promising, but clearly more needs to be done, and we must not repeat the mistakes of the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, when it took a whole decade for the OECD youth unemployment rate to return to the levels we had seen in 2008. So, you know, by 2018, we were just getting back to the levels of 2008 because we started consolidating too soon, we started austerity too soon, and we did not allocate enough resources for this particular issue of getting the young men and women back on their feet, back to the opportunities. Now, to counter the increasing uncertainties, the distrust, the populism, we're currently witnessing a wave of what I would call deliberative democracy, which is bringing young people out into the open, into the process. At the OECD, we're launching a global effort to provide support to bring young people's perspectives into the policy debates on jobs and on learning. So I invite all of you to visit the OECD's online platform that is called I Am the Future of Work. And then make your voices heard through the online survey that is contained there at the I Am the Future of Work, the OECD's online platform. I also invite you to apply to join the new OECD Youth Advisory Board called YouthWise. So you can join us in developing a new OECD action plan for youth. This plan will provide a guide for countries to improve support for young people, as well as help them during this crisis and beyond. So, dear friends, there are issues which you will be grappling with long after the current generation of policymakers is gone. Climate change and the national debt that will accumulate faster already since last year and this year. I always say, by the way, that although our most important, most urgent, more emergent duty is to fight the virus, that our most important intergenerational obligation, our most important intergenerational task is to preserve and protect the planet, to look at the issues like climate change and biodiversity, the oceans, the deserts, etc. So I want to call on you to act, to participate, to tell your leaders, and to tell us what is and what is not working. And this summit is an ideal opportunity to do this. Now, the COVID crisis has reminded us all that our economies and our societies continuously evolve, change, self-organize based on the interactions of billions of individuals. Max Planck once said, I quote, "Science advances one funeral at a time," unquote. So it's dramatically true today. To keep our ideas fresh, to keep them new, innovative, we need to look at the next generation of economists. We need to promote, to approach economics in a much more interdisciplinary way, a way that is more sensitive, one which helps us address the challenges that we all face, that we're all facing. And in the end, it's about ensuring a better future for all. And you are that future. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gurría. That was a fascinating talk. And I think your point about how we're actually very fortunate to be able to continue our studies online is a bit of a reality check for us complaining students at how fortunate we actually really are. So I would now like to begin the Q&A part of this talk with a question which leads on to a point you made earlier, and I think has been a struggle for many governments, not just people themselves. So what do you think is needed more at the moment, trying to open up the economy or tackling the spread of the virus as the top priority, given these two seem to be in opposition? So how can we make trade-offs between global economic recovery and preventing the spread of COVID-19?
Well, first of all, we have to avoid some traps. And the first trap to avoid is to not accept that one has to choose between lives and livelihoods. That is not a dilemma. It's a false dilemma. It's a false choice. Because what we have to do is fight the virus with everything we've got. And the kitchen sink, throw at it everything we got. All the resources, even if it means, increasing the deficit, borrowing more. There'll be time. Because remember, this is, when you're measuring the debt, it's about debt to GDP. If the GDP is allowed to collapse dramatically, the relationship will still grow. So we know the debt is growing because we're borrowing more. The deficits are growing. But remember, by supporting the health system, but by supporting the economy, the unemployed, the SMEs, the tourism sector, the large companies that are suffering, giving guarantees, providing liquidity through central banks, etc., you're basically maintaining the economy, or at least stopping it from dropping further. in the case of the UK, the economy dropped at double digits in 2020, but it would have been worse had it not been for the support that was provided. So first, fight the virus with all we've got. Testing, testing, testing. Vaccination, of course, where the UK is, I think, second in the world to Israel in terms of progress, and of course, with a much, much larger population. So in that sense, the UK seems to be getting it right and be, doing the right things as we move forward. So I would say that is, there'll be time. There'll be later. There'll be time, because if you reduce the length of the fight and you beat the virus sooner, there will be less economic and social consequences that will have to be paid later, will have to be compensated later. So it's a moral, it's an ethical question, but it's also a very practical economic common sense that we should fight the virus first and foremost. Now, the question is that the virus also had this almost immediate impact in 2008 and 2009. You basically had a situation where the impacts were indirect, because the financial sector would then have an impact on the real sector, and the real sector would start to shed some jobs. Here, in the first few months, the pandemic was 10 times more destructive of jobs than was the great financial crisis of 2008. Now, we've since recovered some of the jobs, but then it looked good and suddenly it stopped. It stopped because it was obvious that we were going to recover some of the jobs once we got the economy going again. But then what happened is, not only did we get the third wave, that is December, January, but by September, October, we started losing some of the dynamics and looking at the real damage that had been done, and the millions and millions unemployed. Just to give you a figure, economists are supposed to like figures. There's the ILO suggests that the way to really measure, because we can say, well, they're half of the unemployed in the United States, half have recovered the job, the other half are still unemployed. Okay, well, that may be 20 million or whatever, and that. But then overall in the OECD, you say, well, tens of millions. The ILO says that the real impact has been about a loss of about close to 9% of hours worked. And that is equivalent to around 225 or 250 million jobs, full-time jobs lost. Now, so you don't have 250 million warm bodies that you can show, as being unemployed, that you can benefit or try to benefit, because you have so many informal jobs all over the world. I mean, in my own country, in Mexico, 60% of informal jobs. In India, 80 to 90% of informal jobs. It therefore becomes very difficult to know exactly how many unemployed are there if they were not registered in any social security numbers or anything like that. But if you follow the ILO numbers, 250 million. I mean, and then we're talking about the impact on education. How many of these, at some point in time, 1.5 billion with a B, were without school? How many of them had the capacity to work online? Well, how many of them had connectivity? How many of them had, if they had connectivity, how many of them had the software, but then and the tablets, the hardware? And if they had connectivity and they had the software and the hardware, how many of them had teachers who were trained to teach them online? And hundreds of millions of them did not have any of the above. Okay? So it's very, very dramatic, the damage that has been done. And the recovery, of course, we're saying build back better. Well, we're looking at three different questions. First of all, greener in the sense of let's not do anything that will preserve the situation today, because we don't want the situation today. We want a cleaner. But if you look at the greatest percentages, well, the almost, the gross amounts of the recovery funds, the anti-COVID funds, almost 14 trillion that have been thrown at the COVID, at the pandemic. Most of it is just to preserve and keep the companies. No conditions about saying, how green will you be? How green will you dedicate these investments to be? Are you going to have your investments and your activities and your staff be greener, etc.? No. Now, one can understand it was an emergency. But right now, the money that is supplied, it's been a year now. So from now on, we have to have more conditionality in terms of saying, okay, I want to see where this money is going for the recovery. And it has to go to greener projects. The second one is or the transformation of existing businesses, which would go greener. The second one is that there's more inclusive, which means in the recovery in 2008 and 2009, in the crisis of 2008, 2009, we basically left a lot of people behind. It was less damaging to jobs than the pandemic, but it was still, we lost millions of jobs. And I have to say, we left them out and we haven't picked them up, many of them. And we haven't picked up a lot of the youth that have been demanding, knocking on our door ever since. And that created enormous distress and enormous discontent and flare-ups all over the place. Effectively, I was saying that on average, the OECD countries have about roughly 10%, 9 to 10%. Developing countries have about half or less on average. Some have 6%, some have 3%. And that explains a lot of the difference and a lot of what I would call the robustness, the resilience of the health systems. It also explains why, even if they did have the vaccines, which they don't have today, the availability is a fundamental question. The distribution system and the infrastructure to turn the vaccines into injections into people's arms are very different. And then last but not least, the vaccines are in the hands of about 10 countries, 95% of the vaccines. Those 10 countries have actually bought rights, not necessarily vaccines, because they're all straining and having problems of implementation, but they bought rights to about 3, 4, 5, even 10 times more vaccines than they have population, which means that potentially there is an excess of vaccines, even for the richest countries. But of course, the problem is who's going to pay for the vaccines of the poorest countries, which could be paid with just a minimum of the amounts that these countries have been spending on the virus. Let me just give you, I already mentioned that 14 trillion have so far been spent on the virus. Total ODA, means overseas development assistance, is 153 billion. That's 1/100th of the total amount that has been spent. Imagine, and we cannot fund the COVAX effort. The COVAX effort is the vaccine that would be, that would serve for developing countries and that needs less refrigeration, et cetera, maybe one shot, so it would be available for everybody. Well, we cannot find enough funding for that. Just imagine the tragedy and the problem of allocation of resources, how badly we are getting it, because we're not. So it's not just a question of percentages of GDP. It's also how you spend the money. It also depends on the ages. If you have an older population, an aging population, you will tend to spend more on care, long-term care, repetitive care, et cetera. And on the other hand, if you're a younger population, then you will need less and you will be more oriented towards the infrastructure and things like that. So that's also important. There are also cultural reasons why you spend more or less, and priorities, and then political decisions, leaders. But clearly, the world overall was very ill prepared for this one. But there were some countries that were less ill prepared, or I would say better prepared than others. And this is the results. These are the differentiation, the results that we're seeing today. But this is the single most global phenomenon. The furthest, remotest island in the Pacific, has a case or two. And of course, you have millions and millions and millions in Europe and the United States and Mexico and Brazil, et cetera.
Sorry, okay, excellent, great, thank you very much for that. And then if we go straight on to our next question, well, particularly interesting one, I think. So as the leader of an influential global organization, how are you going to support policy that successfully balances bolstering post-COVID-19 industry recovery with the ever-growing need to tackle climate change? I know it's something you mentioned earlier. So for example, in the aviation industry, how are you going to come up with an effective strategy to boost demand whilst also encouraging airlines to invest in improving their economic impact?
Well, that is a fascinating question, but let me just suggest to you, it may be too complicated. Maybe it may be too sophisticated, okay? Why? Because today, the question between climate and the COVID is very simple. First and foremost, you fight the COVID. You give it everything you got. As I said, this is the most immediate, the most urgent, the most emergent. But don't lose track, don't lose sight of the fact that the single most important intergenerational responsibility is with the planet, is with climate change, fighting climate change, protecting biodiversity, because climate change, we're talking about targets for 2030, 2050. Biodiversity, you're talking about millions of vertebrates whose extinction is on the table today. The mangroves, which are fantastic sinks of carbon, the coral reefs, which even if we succeed to keep the warming at 2 degrees, in fact, even if we are going to keep the warming to 1.5, we're way, far from that. Even if we would still lose about 75% of the corals. And so, Izzy, dear friends, it has now become a cliche that in the oceans in 2050, there's going to be more plastic by weight than fish. I mean, just imagine. Now, the question is, it's so dramatic, it's so tragic that what is most amazing is that we can say so without getting absolutely fired up, which we should. And deserts, of course, they're moving ahead. They're making progress. So every time you look at one of the main ingredients, climate, the question of biodiversity, the question of deserts, the question of the oceans, you see the deficits. So that is our single most important medium and long-term obligation and our lifeline, because if we don't do that, we're going to suffer the consequences. It's going to be much more expensive than whatever it is costing today to do that. It's the same case as the pandemic. Whatever we spend fighting it now, it's going to be less than what we would have to spend if we let it grow, if we let it, go rampant. So in the case of this, there's no conflict. One is the short term, the other one is the medium and the long term, and forever. Forever, that is the one. Long gone will be the COVID-19 virus. We'll probably have yet another virus, somewhere. But the obligation to preserve the only planet we have will still be there.
Excellent. Thank you very much. It's slightly worrying to start thinking about a second virus while we're still in the midst of this one. But I agree. I think that's probably a sort of sad reality of what's coming forward. And you're definitely right. I mean, any complacency about climate change, you're right, we really should be getting angry about it and really worrying. But thank you very much for answering that. We've actually, we have managed to get through our main questions for this session, despite our technical difficulties.
Let me tell you something, Izzy, about Latin America, because you said that you kept them to the side, but just let me make a comment.
That'd be great.
Latin America is being hit hardest. And the reason is, well, the numbers are very dramatic. There's a percentage of the total population in the world that is represented by Latin America. And the percentage of infected is about 3 times more, 4 times more. And the percentage of hospitalizations and dead is a multiple of what they represent of the population. And well, there are a number of reasons, but one of them is that the systems are not resilient enough. The systems are weak. There is not enough investment for the reasons we discussed before. Not investment in health. There are not enough beds. There are not enough doctors, not enough nurses. There are not enough, ventilation systems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's not enough medicines to deal with the symptoms. And There are not enough ambulances to take people. They're faraway places. These tend to be large territories, but also, and they invest much less than the average of the OECD. But it's also the case that they have a lot of poor, that half of the population is poor. Sometimes half of that half is very poor. Those poor and very poor have to go out every day to make a living. And they are informal in the labor market. We can't even account for them. And I can tell you, without going out and making a living, they cannot go back with some food for the house. And there's no government that will give them a check so that they can pay for the food. So basically, you are looking at very vulnerable populations where lockdowns become practically impossible because of the, first of all, the hygienic situations of the dwellings. They tend to be very clustered. They tend to be enormously crowded. And at the same time, because, as I said, people have to go out. So the question of keeping people in and, becomes more difficult. So I think that we have a double problem there. And the solution is, of course, generosity by the more developed countries, but also smart. If they are smart, they will be generous, because they will not be free. They, the richer countries, will not be free of the pandemic until the last country gets rid of it, because we have seen how fast it propagates. Even in places with the toughest regulations like Singapore, etc., it got back through the migrant workers, etc. So it just moves. In a world of mobility like we have today, it moves so fast. So Latin America going through a difficult patch, and maybe it's going to get worse before it gets better. We're talking about Brazil, we're talking about Mexico, we're talking about places like Peru, Ecuador, some of the Central American countries, Bolivia, etc. They are being hit hard, and even the ones who did much better, like Uruguay in the very beginning of the first wave, are now being hit harder. So it's a pretty difficult situation. But that is also happening in everywhere. For example, the Czech Republic did very well. Poland did very well in the first wave, and now they're being hit back. Germany did much better in the first wave, and now it's being hit back harder. So you never know, and we still know little. And with the new strains, it complicates even more, because we don't even know if when the vaccines are available, they're going to be effective against the new strains. And that's a nightmarish scenario. So sorry to be somewhat pessimistic, but as I said, we have the hope of the vaccines, and we have the necessity of the discipline of the population, but then we have the problem that the population sometimes simply cannot be disciplined enough for, survival reasons.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, you're right. Sometimes we can't just be overly optimistic about everything. A little bit of a reality check, certainly, to think about a situation in a sort of feasible way is definitely necessary. And you're right. I mean, Latin America, I'm really glad that you did get the chance to talk about it, because I feel like it is a sort of portion of the world that is sometimes, pushed aside, overlooked, maybe, when we discuss things like this. I mean, in Europe, we tend to have a very Eurocentric view, not least Britain thinking about itself as well. So yeah, thank you very much for shedding light on that.
Okay.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. Thank you, Mr. Gurría. for talking to us. I'd like to just to reiterate the points you made in your opening speech, encouraging people to visit online I Am the Future of Work and to look into applying to join the OECD Youth Advisory Board Youthwise. I thought that was really interesting what you said there, and it would be lovely. So thank you very much, everyone. And we will be, thank you, Mr. Gurría, and we will be sending you a new Zoom link, everyone, to continue our afternoon and evening of sessions, beginning with Oliver Hart starting soon. So thank you very much.